All right. I am here with Paige Harden, a professor of psychology at UT Austin, whose new book is Original Sin. She is one of my favorite researchers. She provided the money quote to my personality article and also my book, which is people who say they're not a little bitchy in their heart are lying. You don't often get that from professors, but when you do, you got to put it in. So I knew I had to talk to her again. So thank you so much for being here. Because all podcasts are basically therapy sessions for the podcast hosts, I wanted to start off by asking this question that I think has underpinned a lot of my research on personality, which is how much are you doomed or blessed, depending on how you look at it, to be like your parents? Like, a big part of my struggle to change my neuroticism for my project is that both my parents are very neurotic, like probably like 10 out of 10 on whatever scale. And so for a long time, I was like, I can't do anything about my neuroticism because all the genetics are very neurotic. So how is that true? Like, am I doomed to be neurotic?
Uh, no. I don't think that you're doomed to be anything, really. And especially not doomed genetically to be neurotic. Most of the time when people think about genetics, they think about genes as something that can make you similar to your parents. And that's true, but your genes can also make you different from your parents. So you only got, 50% of your genes from each parent. And we could get into this more, but it turns out that the genes for personality, they're complicated. There's many of them. Their effects seem to depend on what else you inherited. So, personality is this really interesting thing where it's both highly tied to our genetics and we might be very different from our parents in terms of our personality.
And the way you explain it to me for the book is you get this pantry of ingredients, right? That's your
Yes.
genetic material. But the way it gets combined is somewhat unpredictable. So you don't know if the flour and the eggs are going to become a souffle or quiche or pancakes,
Yeah.
essentially.
So if we're thinking about traits, like let's say like Huntington's disease. So Huntington's disease is a disease that's caused by one gene and you only need one copy of it from one parent. And then you're definitely going to get this disease, right? So in that way, it's a gene that makes you a lot like your parent in having this particular disease because there's only one factor that causes it. Most complex human behavior and personality is especially this case is influenced by thousands upon thousands upon thousands of genetic variants, and their effects seem to both depend on each other and depend on the environment, such that just by reshuffling your parents' genome, which is what happened, when each of us was conceived, could lead to a very, very different product. So what you find is that identical twins who have the exact same genome, so they inherited all of the same ingredients, tend to be very similar for their personality. But as soon as you step down to even just fraternal twins or full siblings, you start to see that they're not that similar at all, and they're not that similar to their parents. And that's because those genes are operating in interaction and they're operating in interaction with the environment. And so I inherited this bit of DNA from my mom to am I, similarly irritable if I haven't had enough sleep? Not necessarily. You don't necessarily get that same connection because personality is influenced by so many things that can interact in different combinations.
You include in your book one of my favorite quotes from Andrew Solomon, which is that there's no such thing as reproduction, only production.
Production.
And it really, once you have a kid, it really hits home that like, wow, I did not reproduce myself. I created a whole new person with all of his own opinions.
Yes, yes. And do you have one
Yeah,
child?
I have one child. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have three, and I have them with two different partners. So I have my two oldest are with my first husband, and then I have a 3-year-old with my second husband. And so it's I've produced 3 children, and they're all different from me, and they're also all different from each other and their fathers. And when you have one, you're like, "Oh, this is what happens if me and my partner combine." And then you have another one and you're like, this is a random draw from the same potential pool of genetic material, but these people are nothing alike.
I feel like that's how people end up with people have a really easy first kid and then they have a second kid and they're like, "Oh, wait."
Yes. So my brother was in that situation where his first is like classic easy baby, and then his second one is like she's here to make some trouble. And I'm really glad that I had it the other way around because I think it makes you a smug parent if you happen to have your easy one first, right? Whereas if you
Yeah.
have your difficult one first, then you're like, let's roll the dice again. Like,
Right. How
let's
hard
see
could it
what
be?
happens.
I've already seen the worst.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, so when people say something like alcoholism runs in my family, so I
Yeah.
like should never drink, is there truth to that? Like,
So that's such a good question. So alcoholism runs in your family the way that most mental illness runs in your family, which is that if you have a first degree relative who has a disorder, then you are more likely to have that disorder yourself. And so some people definitely um respond to that risk, whether it's their family history or now sometimes you get that genetic information, like that genetic risk score, you can find it out about yourself, right? Like if you've done 23andMe, they might say, well, you have a risk for developing this, so maybe you want to exercise more. You have a risk for this, so maybe you want to avoid drinking. um What's interesting about personality relative to like alcohol use is that it seems to be more different in first degree relatives than something like bipolar disorder or alcohol addiction, which does seem to follow this kind of more linear pattern of the more genetically similar you are, the more shared risk you have. But yeah, I mean, it runs in families, to some extent, the way that everything runs in families, right? You are a produced person, but you're produced from a pool of genetic instructions that could come together in a way that elevates your risk for something like an alcohol use disorder.
one thing that you mentioned early in your book is that one of your studies where you kind of created this genetic score for it sounds like bad behavior. And,
Yeah.
you found that less than 20% of people with a low score of this on this, like, bad behavior genetics were ever arrested
Mhm.
for a crime, compared to nearly 40% of people with a high score.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about what that score is and what that's actually showing.
Yeah. So, what we did in this paper, which we published in 2021, is we looked at a variety of behaviors ranging from things that are considered disorders, so like an alcohol use disorder, or ADHD in childhood, to things that are not disorders at all, that are just normal range human behaviors, but are things that are stigmatized or are moralized, or things that maybe someone who's has very conservative values might think is a wrong behavior. Things like having sex at a younger age or having sex with more sexual partners. And what all of these things have in common is that people persist in doing them despite negative consequences. So, early frequent sexual behavior is stigmatized, in the United States. Alcohol use disorder has negative consequences. Children with ADHD do things in school that get them in trouble. And so, what we're looking for is genes that are associated not just with one of these things, but with all of these things. So, they don't just affect how your body metabolizes alcohol. They are associated with an increased risk of drinking and smoking and having sex at an earlier age and having ADHD in childhood. Um, and the advantage of this kind of multi-behavior approach is that you can amass a lot more data than you would be able to if you were just looking at one behavior in isolation. And then what you end up with is this really interesting set of genetic variants, which are associated with doing things despite the fact that they're punished in a way. Um, so then we took those genetic variants and we applied those results to new groups of people, including this longitudinal study of American adolescents who are no longer adolescents. They're my age, but they've been followed since they were in high school, and saw, well, what other things are these genetic variants associated with? And they were associated with what you would think. So they were associated with sexual behavior, with drinking, with smoking. but also with aggression, pulling a knife or gun on someone, ever becoming arrested. And this makes sense if we think about like the criminal justice system is a way that, as a society, we um, have negative consequences for certain behaviors. And what we're looking for are genes that are associated with um, this is wrong, socially, legally, morally. Someone says I shouldn't be doing this. And I'm doing it anyway. And am
Hmm.
I doing it anyway because I can't stop myself, or because I don't care that you think it's wrong, or because the reward I think I'm going to get out of this is more valuable to me than any negative consequence that I'll see. But, you know, one way to think about this in basic terms is just sort of punishment sensitivity, right? We see
Hmm.
this even in animals, that some animals, you shock them once and they're like, I'm never leaving the cage again. And others, you shock them and they're like, I'm going to press the lever more because I believe there's still going to be a drink on the side of this. And those differences exist in humans too. And so that's the genetic index that we're trying to capture here. So it's not deterministic, right? If you're born with these genes, you're not destined to become someone who's committing some sort of criminalized behavior. But it is predisposing you towards doing things that might violate rules or that might have negative consequences, and sort of being indifferent to those negative consequences.
So it's like impulsivity plus not being very sensitive to punishment.
Yeah. So theoretically, people talk about it as a combination of disinhibition and antagonism. So
Hmm.
disinhibition is I'm doing things that are impulsive without regards to their future consequences to myself, right? So I'm having condomless sex at 15 without regards to the fact that this might, risk pregnancy or disease. And antagonism is doing things without regard to the negative consequences for other people.
Hmm.
So I'm doing this and like this might hurt you, like, and you might be unhappy with me, but I don't really care about that as much. So we seem to be picking up a little bit more on the disinhibition than the antagonism, but we seem to be capturing some of both with this kind of set of genes that we've identified.
So you say that it's not deterministic, and I'm wondering, is there something you can do if you um, have that constellation of genes or have that predisposition? Like, is there an Ozempic for this disinhibited renegade behavior?
Yeah. So, I want to come back to the Ozempic thing, but our current best evidence for things that prevent really harmful forms of disinhibition among children who are at this genetic risk come from adoption studies.
Hmm.
So in adoption studies, you're not necessarily measuring someone's genes, but you might say, well, this child has two parents and they both have a long history of substance use problems and antisocial behavior. What are the things in the adoptive family that predict the best outcomes for those kids, given they have this genetic risk? And it seems to be a combination of things that are actually going to be really familiar to anyone who's ever read a parenting book, which is not being really harsh and reactive in your own discipline and also being warm. So, warmth, positive sort of reinforcement and praise for self-control or for pro-social behavior for all children, I think, is more effective than harsh punishment for unwanted behavior. But that seems to be especially true for children who have this kind of genetic liability towards disinhibition.
Hmm.
But if a parent comes into a psychiatrist and said, "Look, I have a child, and yes, they have ADHD, but ADHD doesn't really totally cover it. Like they seem to be aggressive, and they don't really seem to care when they've hurt another child, and they um they're kind of like calculating and mean. What do I do?" There is not a medication that a psychiatrist could prescribe that child. So there's ADHD meds and there's anti-anxiety meds and there's depression meds, but there's no pharmacological treatments for like conduct disorder, which would be psychiatry's label for this. And I think the really tragic case of Rob Reiner's family exemplifies this. All the reporting suggests that Nick Reiner struggled with not just substance use problems, but also aggressive impulses and sort of this impulsive aggression from the time he was a child and a teenager. And this is a family that had a lot of resources and tried a lot of treatment strategies. And that still didn't prevent this really horrible outcome in which he, has been arrested for murdering his parents. And I think that speaks to how few resources there are, maybe relative to some other disorders that onset in childhood, for treating children who then become adolescents, who then turn into grown-ups, who really struggle with this persistent, not just disinhibition, but also antagonism.
I wanted to ask about something that I came across in your book, but also just in other research that I've done. When you talk about, what determines whether someone will be extroverted or introverted, and the line is always like 50% of the variance in personality can be attributed to genes. I can rattle it off from the PDF.
Yeah.
And then I saw that in your book too. 50% of the differences between people in their risk for drug addiction can be traced back to the genetic differences between them. Is it just always 50%, or is it not?
That's a bit like if you were just like to pick randomly, yes, it's not for everything. So if we're looking at, I would say the more serious psychotic disorders, so bipolar 1 with psychotic features or schizophrenia, those estimates tend to be higher. And then when we're looking at things that are not, I would say, big 5 personality traits, but are kind of more narrow dimensions or attitudes. So if you look at right-wing dominance orientation or political liberalism, you get some resemblance between relatives, but it seems to be less than 50%. But for most psychiatric disorders, most personality traits, most complex human behaviors, 50% is like a pretty good prior to have.
Okay. Things. I was like, this 50% is coming up a lot. Like,
yeah.
Or sometimes they'll be like, it's between 40 and 60%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So talk about Brunner syndrome. This was so fascinating. So this is a case where it seems like one small genetic change can actually make a huge difference in aggressive behavior.
Yeah. So most of the time when we're talking about the genetics of personality or behavior genetics generally, most of what we're studying is common variations. So these are genetic differences between people that are present in at least 5% of the population. Some people put it at 1% of the population, but they're not super, super hyper rare specific to one family. And what you see with common genetic variation is that very many genetic variants are related to a trait, and that the effect of each one of those in isolation is really, really small. And that makes sense evolutionarily. If you have a gene with a huge deleterious effect, evolution is going to weed that baby out as quickly as possible, right? So if something's persisting, if genetic variation is persisting, it's usually not going to have a massive deleterious effect on an individual's functioning. So Brunner syndrome is a really fascinating case of a mutation that is extremely rare. It's been found only in a few families, and that seems to have a very large effect on behavior. And that's because it's a variant that affects the function of the protein that it codes for. So it changes the gene such that it no longer makes the thing it's supposed to make. And it turns out that thing that it's supposed to make is an enzyme that is really important for metabolizing a neurotransmitter, which is how our neurons communicate with one another.
And that's serotonin.
And that's serotonin, or the monoamines generally. So what they found in this family is that a rare variant in MAOA, which is this monoamine oxidase A enzyme, which is on your X chromosome, was in the men of this family causing lifelong problems with impulsive aggression. So one raped his sister, one stabbed his boss with a pitchfork, multiple of these men were in jail, whereas the women were functioning, other than dealing with the trauma of living in this family, like functioning fairly normally. And this is a study in the 1990s, and it was a really blockbuster result that I think has been kind of forgotten about a little bit, which is, showing that, one genetic change could profoundly influence what we think of as kind of moral behavior, this ability to, not be going around stabbing people with pitchforks. Um, and that also before the genetic results were in, there wasn't anything obvious that said that these men were suffering from a genetic disorder versus all the other reasons that people might be engaged in impulsive aggression. So they were already caught up in the criminal justice system. Many of them were in prison. And so the legal system couldn't tell the difference really between them and someone who commits a violent crime who doesn't have a genetic cause. So they weren't obviously, incompetent to stand trial, or they wouldn't be considered not guilty by reason of insanity in our judicial process today. So I think it's a rare disorder. Most people, the vast majority of them who are committing, these types of crimes do not have Brunner syndrome. They do not have this rare difference in their MAOA gene. But I do think there is something both unsettling and really interesting to think about. What does it mean if our faculties, which are usually considered in this kind of moral and also legal sense, can be so compromised by this one letter change in our DNA, and also render someone sort of indistinguishable from everyone else in terms of how the criminal justice system treats them. So I find it fascinating, even now, even 30 years later.
Yeah, and you had an interesting line in your book that's like, we perceive behaviors that are biological to be less of a moral failing. I'm wondering why that is. Like, why is it that we feel that way?
So in my book, as you know, I'm talking about this very old debate that animated the early Christian church between Augustine and Pelagius. Augustine was the one who came up with this idea of original sin, which was an innovation in Christianity several hundred years after the life of Christ, but was this idea that like we inherited something and that did not get us off the hook, right? Like according to this kind of Christian doctrine, we inherit the son of fallen nature, and that doesn't make us kind of more worth empathizing with or more liberating us from judgment. It's like further proof that God is right in judging us. And then there was a counterpoint in the early Christian church that was like, what are you talking about? Like, we've had Christianity for nearly 400 years without original sin. And this doesn't sound like the God we've been worshiping at all. And if someone has inherited something, that can't be sin. Sin has to be, will that's separate from the body. And Paul Tillich is this late theologian, and he has this great line, which is like, America is a very Pelagian culture. And I do think that's true, that America is a very like belief in the will and the superseding of the body by the will sort of culture. And so when we're reminded that someone's body is still involved, then we, sometimes that softens our moral judgments. But there's limits to that. So there's good evidence to suggest that for the most severe crimes, if there's murder involved or bodily harm involved, that thinking about someone's genetics might actually make us more punitive, that they're natural born killers, or they're like bad to the bone, or they're necessarily dangerous. So
they must be stopped.
They must be stopped. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's this, what some people have talked about, this double-edged sword when it comes to thinking about what have people inherited, what have they done? Does knowledge of what they've inherited soften our judgments, or does it make them seem even more like outcasts that need to be, contained, that are dangerous in some way?
It's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, it applies to so many things that journalists cover and the way we cover them. If you write about addiction, do you write about it like he has struggled with addiction? Do you say he is an addict? How do you characterize the person's decision to use drugs? It's all, because then there is this whole swing of it's biological, it's a disease, like they cannot help it. And then there was like pushback against that. Anyway, but you also write that that genes influence religion and religious adherence.
They do.
I want to talk more about that because something I noticed. I also grew up in the South like you did, and I know a lot of people and knew a lot of people who grew up very religious. And then it was funny because they would grow up and then maybe stop being Christian, but then they would get like really into yoga or really into Buddhism
Yes,
and be like,
yes.
this is actually the thing. And I was like, you're just doing it again, except for a different idea.
They have a religiously musical mind is one of the quotes that I have in the book. Yeah, this is my dissertation research, which was so obviously me search. I was raised evangelical Christian, and then, as many people in our generation have, left the church of my youth in my 20s, and a transition that was hastened probably by being in an academic psychology department. And so my dissertation was on differences in religiosity between twins. And what you see is that in early life, when your parents are dragging you to church, like, it's the shared environment that predominates. It's this, what do your parents say you're doing in your family culture? If you ask people, how often do you pray? Do you believe in God? Do you believe in the inerrancies of your religious traditions, written work? How often do you go to other religious activities? And then what you see is it looks a lot like personality,
Hmm.
honestly. And or in terms of the pattern that you see in twin studies, there has not yet been a good GWAS of religiosity. And I think it's because,
Genome-wide association study.
yes, there's not yet been a big, large scale hunt for specific genes associated with how religious you are.
So what you're saying is people start out very similarly religious to their family of origin, but then it kind of branches off based on the influences that you
Yeah.
encounter throughout your life.
Yeah. I mean, it looks a lot like personality. What you see about personality is that people continue to diverge from their relatives until their early 30s, really. And that's also what we see for religiousness, which is that people are very similar regardless of their genetic relationship to their siblings in childhood, and they become less similar in adolescence. And then as they move through young adulthood, especially in some religious traditions, like the one I was raised in, there's so much emphasis on individual belief. And I think that can be hard to manufacture if you don't have the disposition for it. And so people start to drift into their own kind of idiosyncratic spaces, which might be a reflection of their own personalities and not their family upbringing, as they move into adulthood.
Yeah. I'm curious, given all this research that you've done and everything you know about genetics, what do you make of those IVF services that offer to make you a perfect baby through genetic testing? They're like, we'll pick the embryo that's the smartest and the prettiest and the nicest and put that one in. And I'm just always like, is that going to actually work? Or are you just going to get some random kid like everyone else does?
I mean, I've been writing about this a lot on my own Substack. And my reactions to it are really complicated. And on the one side, reproductive autonomy is really important. And I think that we're living in a time in which, people are proposing not just bans on abortion, but outright bans on IVF, which has been so important to so many people to create their families. And so I'm very cautious about maligning anyone's motivations or choices when they're trying to have a family, right? Like, having a kid is one of the riskiest, most optimistic things that you can ever do. And so if you really feel like there's a risk you're afraid of and someone's selling you, I can mitigate that genetically by you doing IVF. I completely understand that motivation. At the same time, I feel like the companies are painting an overly optimistic and deterministic picture of what can be achieved. There was a recent ad campaign by one of these companies where there's ads all over the New York City subway system, like, have your best baby.
Yeah.
And I just, As a parent, I just think, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Like, which of my babies is my best baby, right? Like, babies are people, and people are complicated, and it is very difficult to reduce I would say impossible to reduce the complexity of this person that you are then going to be tasked to getting to know into a set of numerical indicators where you can be like, this one's the best baby. Um, and there are some things, and especially if you have a family history of them, and especially if one of the reasons that you're even worried about reproducing in the first place is, I don't know. I mean, I have a acquaintance a friend who read an early copy of my book, and she was like, "You've written about why I didn't have kids." And I was
Mhm.
floored. I never knew this. And she, divulged that she had a sibling, a family member who has always been impulsive and aggressive and struggled with substance use problems. And she's always feared, is that genetic? And if that's genetic, do I carry it? Do I want to bring a child into that world? And so if she said to me, I want to just minimize the child's risk of alcohol use disorder. And I know I can't eradicate it entirely, but like maybe I can just dial the risk down a little bit. Like, who am I to say that that's not, the right choice for her in terms of bringing her family into the world? So I think it's really complicated. How do we support people's reproductive autonomy, but how do we resist this kind of what I think of as kind of overly slick, optimistic kind of tech babble? That's a tough question. Oh.
You also write, genes make a difference, but genes are not usually destiny. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so there are genetic differences, rare variants of large effect, or big chromosomal abnormalities, like the Brenner syndrome, or like, trisomy 18 or Down syndrome, where if that happens, it's going to overwhelmingly affect your life in ways that are pretty constant across time and space, right? So if you get the Brenner syndrome mutation, it seems that you are going to struggle with impulsive aggression, regardless of what else is going on. Um, Most genes, though, most of our genetic variants, though, are not like that. Again, because evolution is very good at weeding those out. Most of what we're talking about is common genetic variation that changes the probability of something, but like a little bit in combination with other things. So I give this example in my book where I talk about um, this Texas couple who had a beloved bull. They had a cow, a male bull is what I'm talking about, named Chance. And it was like this gentle, docile. I don't know how you fall in love with a bull. I'm not that Texan that I know that I know how you fall in love with your pet cow, but they loved it. And then it died and they cloned it, right? So you have a clone of this animal with the exact same genotype, but different mother, different epigenetics, different other things. And then they named it Second Chance, the the clone bull, and it gored its owners twice because they just kept being like, "Well, we had a docile bull and we cloned it, so can't we expect it?" And this new bull was like, "I'm not having any of this. Like, I don't want you people near me," and like put them in the emergency room. I'm like, that's a cow, right? Like, that is a cow that we can rear under exact rearing circumstances with the exact same clone genotype. And you end up with a different level of aggression. And think how much more complicated people are in terms of their socialization in rearing. So, I think whenever people are tempted to think about genes as destiny, they should think about chance and second chance and how well that worked out.
Right. That's so interesting. It's like that movie Multiplicity, where each successive copy, he gets weirder and weirder.
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
anyway, you had one description about gene environment interaction that I really liked, which was children genetically predisposed toward faster development in toddlerhood elicit more cognitive stimulation from their parents, which in turn predicts faster language development by kindergarten, a gene development environment development feedback loop that is more pronounced in children whose families have plentiful resources.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting. Our genes kind of elicit ways of people treating us that then influence us even more.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say my most extroverted child genetically is my third one. And we took her to Italy with us when she was like a year old. And my husband just wore her in the ergo. And we would be sitting on the subway and she would just like find someone to look at and just smile at them. And so everywhere we went, the whole week, it was like Italian grannies, but also teenagers, but also like Milanese businessmen just being like, oh, ciao, bello, you're so
Yeah.
beautiful. Right? And I just thought, she's having an experience of the world in which everyone is smiley and she's smiley. And like people are such a source of reward for her. And like now she's going to go back to them. And I was like, this is the gene environment feedback loop that builds personality in real time. I'm watching it happen in real time, that you have this tendency towards positive affect and it elicits something from the world. Like if I got on the subway, I would not be like, oh, everyone is beautiful. Life is beautiful. Like, don't we love people? You know, like that would not be my experience of the world, but I wouldn't be putting out that energy that like gets that experience either. And so it's amazing how evolution has equipped us to build each other and to build ourselves in community. You know, we have this initial program and then it's scaffolded by living in society, living with other people. And it snowballs in these interesting ways.
That is so funny. I also don't have that energy. And in fact, when I'm in public, people often ask me what's wrong. And I'm like, nothing. This is my normal face.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Well, good for your daughter. She's gonna be the captain of the cheerleading squad.
She is. She is.
Well, yeah. So, and then at the very end, you asked this very poignant question, which is, when a lot of times when we talk about how much our genes influence our lives or our behavior, the real question is, can I change? I think that was ultimately like the question I was wondering about in all of our like many phone calls is, if something is genetic, can it be changed?
It's a very common association that genetic means unchangeable and
Yeah.
environmental means changeable. And if we stop and think about that for 5 seconds, we know it's not true, right? Like we know that there are people who've had very severe childhood trauma and that's environmental, but it's really hard to recover from. And we don't have like obvious solutions to make them feel better. And we also know, I mean, I think we're living through this revolution, is that people might have a genetic set point for being, higher weight, and we give them a pharmaceutical, right? And now they're saying, oh, it's not even an injection, it's a drug, and we change that set point, right? So the relationship between genetic versus environmental and changeable versus not changeable is not nearly as straightforward as is commonly assumed. Why do we have that assumption? My speculation in the book, one of the things I invite readers to consider, is that it's very Christian of us to think that way. Even if we weren't raised Christian, even if we weren't raised in that faith tradition, even if we think of ourselves as entirely secular, this idea that our flesh, our genes, are the things that are like weighing us down and holding us back and are insurmountable without divine salvation is an extremely Augustinian way of viewing the flesh and of viewing the self. And I think that even if we aren't personally steeped in that tradition, we are intellectually all steeped in that tradition. And so what would it be like to think of our bodies as also a source of virtue and not just vice, also a source of change and not just stagnation. I think it would have us, it would require us to revise some really like deep seated cultural narratives about the relationship between our identities and our bodies. And then also I want to say that like it's very American of us to think about how can I change myself versus how can we collectively change the way that we're operating such that myself fits better within this system, right? Like, do we want to change the ADHD child, or do we want to change the way that classroom demands are set up so that more people can flourish within them? So I think it's the combination of our Christianity and our individualism. And I'm saying that culturally, our cultural individualism and our cultural Christianity that really keeps like dragging people down to this, like, because it's genetic, I can't change it. And if I can't change myself, I'm doomed.
Huh.
Versus how can we change? We What humans are great at is being plastic culturally. Like that's our great um advantage over all other species is our incredible capacity for cultural innovation and reorganizing the ways in which we relate to each other, much more than I think we have to like individually optimize through force of effort ourselves. I don't think that's our most evolutionarily blessed capacity. So that's I feel like there's some of the emphasis should be shifted in that way.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Paige. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Her new book is Original Sin. And when does it come out and where can you
It
get
comes
it?
out March 3rd, 2026, and you're my first conversation about it. So I'm really excited to be able to begin having these conversations.
Yeah, well, this was awesome. Thank you again so much.